Howdy folks, I'm Mark. I make stuff, and today we're going to be talking about making games with JavaScript and React. Why games, you ask? Well, actually, you're not asking. Have you ever noticed that when people say, people often ask me, it's almost always a lie, just to fit the format of what they're saying? Anyway, I make them because they're a great creative outlet. I've made games ever since I was a little kid in BASIC on a TRS-80. Games are fun to make, and hopefully they're fun to play, and maybe, just maybe, people might enjoy playing your game. Most importantly though, and really the focus of what we're going to be talking about today, games are a great learning opportunity. As a software engineer, you're constantly making side projects to expand your skill set or to sharpen existing skills. And for me personally, if I'm working on a project based on a tutorial or I work through a small sample project, I don't feel like it often sinks into my bones the way it does if I build a project all the way through to production and get it in front of people who might ask for changes or notice bugs. And the great thing about making a game, of course, is that there's an incentive to take that project all the way to production so you can share it with your friends and other people on the internet, and they have an incentive to play it because hopefully it's fun. And that leads me to a disclaimer. I'm going to be talking about my own personal experiences with game development and React. I am not going to be telling you how to do things as if there's only one way to do it. Another thing too, if you look at your old code and from a couple of years ago, as I've had to do in preparing for this talk, and you see stuff that maybe you're a little embarrassed by because you have a better idea about how to write that code now. To borrow an old shampoo commercial, that's the tingle that lets you know it's working. You're learning, you're doing what you're supposed to do. There's no reason to feel embarrassed. Now, it's a free country. You can feel embarrassed if you want to, but you don't have to. End of disclaimer. Back in the early 2000s, I made a lot of Flash games. Probably too many. I loved it. It was super fun. Flash is gone. Flash had to die. I'm very sad to see it go, but I loved it and I miss it every day like an old friend. And after that, I got into making games and game-like kids book apps for publishers for iOS devices, as well as the Highlights for Children Hidden Pictures app in the mid-2010s. And that led to some JavaScript games for Random House and things like that. It was a lot of fun. I was really lucky to be able to work on that stuff. After that, I got more into making games with engines like Unity and Godot. Those are more like games you would download from an app store and play on your desktop on a Windows PC or a Mac. Just last year, I made a game called Star Squadron Student Driver. I struggle to describe it. It's basically a survival space shooter where your only weapon shoots ping pong balls. I should probably have disclosed that most of the projects I do are kind of silly, or they have some kind of element that makes them feel kind of whimsical or dumb. Take your pick. I put it out on Steam for free just to see what that process was like. But really today we're going to be talking about React games. Some of the games that you see here we're going to be talking about in a little more detail later on. Every one of these games taught me something really valuable about the libraries and the patterns that I use in my day job every day of the week. I did want to mention that there are some really great game engines out there for JavaScript, and I definitely encourage you to check out Kaboom and Pixie and Phaser. Three.js is really cool. It's not strictly a game engine necessarily on its own, but you definitely can make games with it. In the process of making games in React, you're going to run into a lot of the concepts that you might be very familiar with and may use every single day, but you're going to see them from a different perspective, or you're going to be able to learn them a little more deeply, because in a game environment, very often the interactivity, the state update speed, those kinds of things that never seemed like an issue before become an issue very, very quickly. We're going to get into each of these topics in a little more detail as we go along. Let's talk about planning a game project. I found it really helpful to begin thinking about the distribution method in the very beginning of the process. How do people engage with this hypothetical product that you're making? Are they going to play it directly in a web browser? Are they going to download it from an app store? Are they going to download it from a website? How are you going to monetize it? Do you want to monetize it? Those kinds of questions up front are very helpful because they're going to help you guide your decisions as you start making technical and creative decisions along the line. For example, if you want to make a game for a web browser, something turn-based might be ideal for that. Something that's very fast-paced and action-oriented might work just fine in the browser, but it may not work really well on everyone's web browser. You may want to think about that. And every one of these approaches has pluses and minuses. If you make a game in Godot or Unity and have people download it from Steam, for example, that might be great for performance in some ways, but it's going to put up a little bit of a barrier to people finding your game and playing it. If it's on the web, it might be more accessible to everybody in the world, but then you might have other issues about performance, and also people are going to be downloading those same assets over and over again if they're playing the game. Whereas with an app, they download it one time and they're done. So you want to bear those things in mind. Let's think about art considerations as well. When I say art considerations, I'm saying, what are you committing to creatively for your game? So, for example, if you want to make a game that is a card game, like Solitaire or something like that, you could probably find assets for that fairly easily, and you're not going to be making up a whole bunch of new artwork for that. If you wanted to make a tile-based game, you're going to be making some tile sets, or you're going to be sourcing those tile sets somehow. It's more of a programmatic approach to your artwork. You're going to be making your levels with your tile set. Or in a more extreme example, let's say it's a point-and-click adventure game, and it might seem really simple to you, but from an art standpoint, it might be very intensive. You might have to create brand new vector art or pixel art for every one of those backgrounds. That could be a lot more work than you might feel like you want to do. I also think it's a good idea to decide up front what's most important to you. Why are you making the game? For example, do you want to reach a lot of people? Do you want to monetize this? You want to make a lot of money? Is this about creative control? You have an idea that you really want to get across? You want to show off a little bit, technically, creatively? Of all the items on this list, none of them are necessarily better than anything else. In fact, they're not even mutually exclusive. You might decide that 2 or 3 of them are really important to you. For me personally, I'm not good at the business part of it, so I'm not interested in the money, and I'm not very good at figuring out what people want to play. I'm much more interested in making the kind of games that I want to play, and if other people want to play it, that's fine. So I'm much more interested in the second 2 things. And these are only a couple of items. There could be way more things that are important to you. A note about project scope. A lot of times when I talk to people who are making games for the first time, it's very easy to get in over your head or to bite off more than you can chew. Personally, I don't think there's anything wrong with getting in over your head. I happen to think that the best way to learn is to get in over your head and get a little bit scared, doubt yourself a little bit, and then you make the thing and you go through that process of, I can't, I will, I did. That's how you earn confidence in pretty much anything, not just software development. But on the same token, it's really easy to get overwhelmed. For me, I usually like to pick a couple of new items for each project that are things I want to practice, things I want to try that are new, things that I want to focus on technically that I don't have an instant answer to. If I had an instant answer to every aspect of a project, I'm in no way interested because I've already done it. One thing to be aware of when it comes to scope is that if you limit that scope to something that's manageable, and especially early on, maybe make it really, really small, not even a mini game, but a micro game, that's going to put you in a position where you're more likely to finish the game and to put it in people's hands and get that feedback that you need. I happen to know enough about myself to know that if I work on something for more than a couple of months, I'm going to start to hate it. So I try to keep my projects bite-sized or snack-sized to keep them from getting out of control. So John, Paul, George, and Ringo here have good advice for you to keep it simple, silly. So a design document is kind of like a paper prototype. You're going to use that document to describe what you want to do to somebody else you might be collaborating with, or even to your future self. So in case you can't get to the project right away, you can at least think about it. It also forces you to get your ducks in a row before you start making assets, and that is a discipline that I have always struggled with. I want to just start making a POC on the day I have the idea, and I found that it's almost always better to just write up a document and think it through, and then maybe what I find is the project I end up diving into is different because I had a chance to think it through a little bit. So think through the mechanics, the tone that you're trying to achieve, walk through the game loop and the user experience, and think about how the player is going to engage with the game. For me, I often have some of my favorite ideas while I'm in the middle of working on something else and I can't stop and work on it. So I sometimes when people are stuck for an idea for a game, by the way, I usually tell them to start on something else and you'll probably come up with a better idea while you're in the middle of that. Another thing to mention at this point is game design documents are really good for making a game from the outside in, which is a very professional way of doing it. You can, for example, sit down and say, I know pretty much what it's going to look like. I know what audience I'm making it for. I know a lot of the marketing elements of it, more or less, before I get to the details of what the game mechanics are going to be. So for me, the most fun way to do it is inside out, which is I start with a game mechanic and I work outward toward presentation, story, marketing, all the rest of it. So for the Star Squadron Student Driver game, I worked on the core game mechanic for about a month, and it was just the player controller. I wanted something at first that was more like asteroids. Rotate left, rotate right, and thrust. That was not what I wanted, and so I came up with a hybrid that was up, down, left, right, but the ship would rotate to match what you were doing. And I liked that a lot better. Once I got the control mechanic the way I wanted it, then the other pieces of it creatively seemed to hang on that central game mechanic fairly easily. Also, one thing I really want to mention at this point is the value proposition for the player. I tend to give my games away for free. I do this because I have a job and I don't want your money. Even though I'm giving my games away for free, I have to recognize that when people play my games, they are doing me a favor. At the end of the day, we all have things we could do with our time. And if somebody chooses to spend some of that time and that effort on your game, they are doing you an enormous favor. And what's really cool, of course, is when they do that, they took this thing that was in your head, the thing that was living in your brain, and now it's in theirs. So when they do that, they're closing a loop on a really cool, magical thing that's, I guess, art, and on the fairly short list of coolest things we can do as human beings. Creating something that lives in somebody else's head has got to be near the top of the list. The game I made for this talk is called Tic-Tac-Know, K-N-O-W, because I am terrible at naming things. Don't ask me to name things. I am bad at it. I thought it was funny in August when I was asked to come up with this talk. Now I don't think so. It's basically a very simple tic-tac-toe game. You flip a coin to see who goes first. It learns as you play by storing historical game data, if it's unique, in your local storage, that kind of thing. It doesn't really qualify as machine learning. Well, that's not really the point. The point is that you have 4 different levels of intelligence you can choose to play against, and some of them are difficult, even though the algorithm is actually surprisingly simple, and the one that's complicated takes a while for you to train it so that it's smarter than the very simple one. And this is the basic game loop for Tic-Tac-Know, and the reason I chose this style of game is that it has a very simple game loop, and you can kind of see through the flow here. We figure out whose turn it is. Either the computer or the player will make a selection, we animate that selection, then we figure out if somebody won the game, or if there was a draw. If it was a game end situation, then we display that, and we store the value from the game if it's unique, and we update the wins and losses. If not, we start another round, we figure out whose turn it is. And that's basically it. So here's the game that we're talking about. This logo up here is just SVG, and we're using CSS to make these pieces appear to come in and out randomly, but it's just a pattern. This is for resetting the local storage memory of past games. And we'll choose X, and we can choose whichever intelligence level we want to play against. These aren't necessarily in order of how smart they are. This is the random one. This one will look 1 move into the future. It's actually the toughest one because it's actually really hard to beat it if it can look 1 move into the future. This one can look pretty deep into the future using records of past games and past moves and try to figure that out. But this algorithm is actually much simpler, and it actually wins more often because it doesn't have to train to know how to beat you. This one just picks at random from different elements. We're going to go with the randomized one. We have a coin toss. We won the coin toss, so we're going to go middle, because who wouldn't go in the middle? We're going to go here, and if we were going Killer Instinct, it would automatically go up here to prevent us from winning. But we can go there and win if we want, right? For Tic-Tac-Know, the game component is kind of the main component for the game, and then we're just doing a couple of layers of prop drilling. to get these props down to the relevant components. If I felt strongly about that, I could probably just put together a custom use context hook to grab all this stuff. It didn't seem to make a lot of sense, but so I didn't in this case, but you certainly could, right? If you felt strongly about it. So in this case, you can see that we have separate use state instances for the pieces of the game state. In turn-based games, very often I will use just a single game state object that may have a complicated shape, and I'll keep a shape file somewhere, or I'll use TypeScript and keep that interface file somewhere. In this case, because you're playing against a computer, keeping these separate made a lot more sense so that we could easily access that with some of the helper functions for the game. One of the first things you may notice when working on a game in React is that set state is not instantaneous. I'm not telling you anything you don't already know. It's something you've probably known since the first day you started working with React. Set state is not instantaneous. But you may not have felt it quite as hard as you feel it when you're working with a game in React, because state is updating pretty quickly and the user/player is sending a lot of inputs to the application. So we have to be careful. A couple of things we can do. We can use the previous state in our state setter. This is also a great use case for use effect hooks. We're using a handful of use effect hooks here to check when a game is over. So game result means that the game is done. And so we check to see who won, right? It could be the player, it could be the CPU, or it could be a draw, right? So we're going to update our wins and losses through this function, and it's going to save it to local state. So you can see that in a couple of different cases, we're using use effect in this way to catch these changes and react accordingly. So going into this project, one of the main things I wanted to work on was getting better at testing, specifically with React Test Library. And one thing I really like about Test Library, we have some really nice asynchronous functions that allow me to simulate clicks for integration testing. So in a case like this, I'm firing an event for the start button. I'm waiting for the first cell to be available to click on, right? To not be disabled. And then we're gonna fire a click on that. So the first play of the game will happen. Now you might ask, but you probably aren't, but you might ask, why do we know that we won the coin toss, right? So we click start, there's a coin toss to see who goes first. It could be the CPU, could be me. Well, it's going to be the player because we are mocking random. Running unit tests on games, randomization is going to mess with everything you do, right? When you're testing, you want that repeatability. And so I'm using a library to mock random, but honestly, looking back on it, if I were building this now, I would just mock it with like a global. I'll show you in a second how we mock local storage, but that's basically the idea here. But by mocking random, it's always going to return 0. So it's always going to return heads or tails, whatever it is. So if you say to match snapshot, you can be confident that this won't change every other time you run this test. We're testing the version of the computer's intelligence where it's going to look at previous records. In order to do that in our testing, we are going to fake out local storage. So we go storage, prototype, get item, and then get item will return this specifically designed string, which can be parsed in JSON, and that will tell the computer that it wants to choose a specific value. In this case, to choose value 3, because we're telling it, hey, the player's going to win unless you choose cell 3. And then again, we do the same thing, but we return an empty value for that history. And that will return value 1 because it's going to default to random, which again is going to be the first item in the list, which would be the first cell, which is cell 1. So this is a reverse engineered text adventure engine based on the Scott and Alexis Adams pirate adventure engine from 1978. I'm a big fan of those games and those people. I did put together another video that's a little more in depth on the history of that original game, what I ended up doing here, why I did this, and the 2 new games that I made for this. And I'm making a note for future me to add a card or something. future me is going to add a card or a link or something. Thank you. Also, there's a link in the description. But basically, this is a text adventure game. Basically, you know, go north, go south, that kind of thing. This is kind of a fun game. It's sort of related to Greek mythology in a weird way. The reason I bring up the text adventure game is kind of a cautionary tale about managing objects in your JavaScript game. Objects are not passed as actual objects. They're passed as references to objects. We move things around between functions and other things in JavaScript. Well, we all know that academically, but sometimes late at night when you're working on a side project, all that goes out the window and you start to scratch your head trying to figure out why this very basic thing isn't working the way you expected. And this is a good example of that. So in a text adventure game, almost all of your game logic really exists in this player turn function, because once they enter a noun and a verb, it's going to pull in the data. We're going to take in the game state, and then we're going to run the logic against what we've said we want to do based on our inventory and all that other stuff. And then we're going to end up with a changed game state at the end, and that's what we're going to send to the set state. What I had been doing was I kept an old game state copy of the object around to compare old and new game state to see if, for example, the player's location had changed. Well, the problem with that, of course, is, again, it was very late at night. And I forgot that when I make a copy of game state, I'm copying the reference, not the actual object. And so when I changed game state to change the location of the player, the historical version was also being changed, right? That makes perfect sense when it's not 2 o'clock in the morning. There are loads of ways around this issue. In this case, what I did was I just created this new object based on just the handful of things I actually needed out of game state. The other way of doing this is wrap the whole thing inside of a use state setter, and then I can bring in my previous state from there. That's one way I could have done that. This is a game called Noodle Quest. It was started as a pandemic project. I thought, oh, little kids would love this when they're stuck home from school. The intent of this was to get better at using Memoization and React Memo to calm down unnecessary re-renders. So you can see it's pretty responsive, even though there are over 100, I would guess, cells on screen at any given time. So we're picking up these. You can see we have an inventory. We have a dialogue system here, just uses MUI. And we have different areas we can go to. So this is actually a floor below where we were. And because we have the key, we can open the door. We can go to other parts of the map. In the Noodle Quest code, we can see that we're using use memo here to calm down the unnecessary re-renders, especially when it comes to depth sorting, because with isometric games like this, the sorting of different objects to be in front of or behind objects as they go vertically up and down the screen, that's going to change their depth. So we needed to be very careful about preventing these groups of layers from causing too many re-renders. And then here is the tile component, and it's multi-purpose. It gets used for all of these items. We're using a memoized version of the component in React Memo to help calm down those unnecessary re-renders. As far as the SVG animations are concerned, this is a great example of a component I would definitely not build this way if I were building it right now. This is like, what, a 400 line, 500 line component. You could break this up into body parts pretty easily. But you can see this is all just SVG. These are line, circle, path, and you can even use this animate tag, which is specific to this kind of work. Really fun stuff. This was really fun to put together. You'll notice too that in some cases, some browsers won't respect the CSS animations of these SVG elements. We have to zero pad some of our values. So when we go to the CSS, you'll see, for example, we have this animation 1.2 seconds linear player going up, for example. Well, if this was 0.2 seconds, and if I just said 0.2, without a zero up front, browsers like Firefox would not recognize that, would see that as a syntax error. Other browsers will understand what you mean and go for that and animate that properly, but Firefox was giving me problems. So one thing to bear in mind when you're doing this kind of stuff is when you run into trouble with these kinds of animations, just making sure that your values are zero padded may be a path to a solution for you. You can see that this CSS is actually pretty simple. Here's the going up animation and the going down as the player is facing us or facing away. This was enormously fun to put together, to design the system of how this player controller would work. This is not technically a React game. I built this just in raw JavaScript years ago, but it's a good example of using games with JavaScript and SVG animations. This is basically an update of Mugwomp, which was an old terminal game that you'd play on the terminal or on an old VIC-20 or something like that, old game you'd make in BASIC. This has graphics, and we also, I think, flipped the tables, so now you're the Mugwump and you're hunting the people, I think. I can't remember what I did here. But you can see cute little detail that the character blinks, and if we refresh the page, you can see it when he drops in, he waves at you, which was actually really easy to do. But I did this in vanilla JavaScript, so I did, some timeouts, adding and removing classes to make that happen. So this was a lot of fun. I'm very bad at this game. I'm not demoing this game because I'm very, very bad at it. This is a minimalist RPG that I'm working on. So instead of going through a landscape with a character controller, you're actually just going to click on parts of the map. It's sort of based on or inspired by games like Kingdom of Loathing. So we can go into the town. You can see there's a lot of temp art in here. There's no real art here to speak of in some cases, but we can go into the shop and we can buy items. We can actually even sell the fancy buckle that we have, and to earn money to buy spells and healing potions and stuff like that. Adventure game stuff. The reason I bring this up is this is an SVG character creator. I wanted to make a character creator where you didn't have a gender because the gender is kind of irrelevant to the gameplay. And so I wanted to make it as androgynous as possible. And so honestly, I'm thinking about getting rid of all of these controls because honestly, I have a lot of fun just doing this. This is just a randomizer that, the Princess Leia with the kiss makeup is my favorite. So, I like the character creator. I'm not super jazzed about the rest of it. Maybe I'll finish it. Maybe I won't. I'm not sure. This game is called Figure 5 Frenzy. It's a math card game that I made for Flash. I actually made a multiplayer version of this in Flash about 10 years ago. And then this is a React version of it. If we play it, hopefully I'll get an easy hand. So we got to do 6. Actually, it won't be too bad. This will be easy. So 10 minus 9, and then 7 minus 2 is 7. Actually, we probably want this over here. Then we subtract it, and we win. Yay! I'm very bad at this game, so I'm gonna just quit. I'm very bad at my own games. So that's how this works, but the reason I brought this up is that in the scores section, this is coming from a microservice that I created in AWS because I wanted an excuse to use Lambda as an API gateway, and DynamoDB. And after brainstorming for quite a while, this was the best idea I could come up with, was a high scores application. I don't have time to get into the details of that, and actually there's a separate video for that, and hopefully I will have had the presence of mind to put a little card up on the screen to tell you where to find that. But the reason I bring that up is that in this case, it worked perfectly in development. When I pushed it to production, it became clear that I had an architectural issue. At the end of the day, it was a fairly easy fix of just separating some responsibilities in the API gateway, but it was a really neat example of what I can learn about my own mistakes when I take it to production. Most of the side projects I make in React will end up getting hosted on an S3 bucket. So let me walk you through that deployment process and some of the potential pitfalls. First of all, when you're deploying to S3, you're going to probably want to test each step along the way. So if there were issues, you can figure out where they started. With your S3 bucket, you're going to enable hosting and you're going to make your objects public with a bucket policy. We'll go to AWS certificates to create a certificate for our domain or subdomain. We're going to use that certificate in our CloudFront distribution. The CloudFront distribution is going to take our S3 bucket and going to make a cache for it. And we're going to use our AWS cert, and we are going to set up some custom errors for 404 and 403 that will return the browser to index.html. And very importantly here, it will return a 200. Now, this last part, I used to sometimes forget to do that, and then you would have all kinds of issues, sometimes related to deep linking and things like that. In Route 53, you can connect your CloudFront distro to your hosted zone, and you're going to create aliases pointing to your CloudFront distro for A and 4A, that's for IPv6. You can set up your AWS CLI, log in, and then you can use an NPM script to build and deploy for you automatically. It's pretty simple once you set it up. A note about deploying to itch.io. You can certainly deploy HTML games on itch.io, that's well known, but I've seen several notes on the internet about not being able to deploy React games on itch, and it turns out it's actually not that hard. All you have to do is go into your package file and add the homepage prop at the root of your package JSON and make the value a dot, basically saying, look in this directory. So let's say you want to make a game. Let's say you want to make a game in React. Where is your idea going to come from? Sometimes it's helpful to take a common game type that you already like, simplify it, and put your own twist on it. And that way you're replicating a game mechanic that you already know is probably going to be fun. One thing that I've always wanted to do is adapt a work of classic literature, i.e. public domain, Pride and Prejudice as a dating sim, Antigone as a stealth tactics game, Don Quixote as a windmill beat-em-up, or Brothers Karamazov as an 8-bit platformer. As we're rounding the last corner here, I really want to encourage you to finish that project that you have on your plate, or start the one that you have in your head. The turtle has a really good point, but I think he's also missing the point when it comes to making games anyway. In this world, there are two types of fun, right? There's fun while it's happening. That's type 1 fun. Making games is fun, especially at the beginning. Right? The beginning of a game project is fun. It's the only thing you want to do when you start working on it. Type 2 fun is only fun in retrospect. I went on a big backpacking trip this summer. It was one of those we call type 2 fun. Once you're off the mountain and your muscles stop hurting, oh, it was really, really fun. Maybe at the time it was tough, but once it's all over, it's fun. And I think that's true of game development. That last quarter of a project, that can be type 2 fun, where it's fun, but only when you're done and you get to share it with people. I just really, really hope that you don't give up on your idea, even if you think it's garbage. Because frankly, and I'm not even kidding, I think the world needs more bad games. Uniquely bad games. The world is full of too many games that are samey and bad, but uniquely bad? Oh, that's great. So go out and make something uniquely bad. Break a game mechanic in a way that nobody's done before. Do something so bad it cannot be ignored. You can do it.